I recently came to the conclusion that I might be the boogeyman of my playgroup. Not for any nefarious reasons, but simply because I'm almost always a threat and probably win a bit too much. Now, this could be because some of my favorite decks to play in Commander are my O-Dragon deck, my Eldrazi deck, and my Ian Malcolm Dinosaur deck. It's also equally likely that I've probably just played a lot more Magic than most of my playgroup. As such, I decided to build some fun, interesting, and slightly less scary decks. Now, I can fully appreciate the irony here, given I've ended up playing the least intimidating villain ever, Sauron. But that's because I wanted to try and have some fun with the mass, and another member of my playgroup had already called dibs on Saruman. So off I went to EDHRec, and I very quickly realized that the average deck list on there was not only suboptimal, but it seemed way more of a one-way trip to Flavortown than being a well-oiled Commander machine. It seemed like it was simply a Lord of the Rings tribal deck. It is at best suboptimal, and at worst, just bad. Now don't get me wrong, I love a bit of flavor as much as the next guy. But the real excitement for me in playing Commander is doing interesting, cool, and powerful things with your friends. Assembling all of the Lord of the Rings baddies is cool and all, but if every game ends up with your group of baddies just getting taken to Pound Town, it's going to get boring real quick. I think Sauron could easily go both ways. And by that, I mean heavy on either creatures or heavy on spells. I think the optimal deck is going to be all about using your graveyard. And with that in mind, here's why I think the standard deck on EDHRec is wrong. Starting with a return to Flavortown. There are a bunch of cards in here that, whilst are great flavor fits, don't really synergize with either Sauron or the army strategy at all. Then, we've got a bunch of Amass and Army Augment cards that are just slow and expensive. And don't even get me started on the inclusion of Emrakul, World Anew. Show me someone who says they're going to pay that 6 colorless mana cost, and I will show you a liar. All in all, a deck that seems confused, clunky, and a strategy that's just doing a little bit of everything quite badly. So, let's fix that. I decided to go with a spell-heavy route. And that's because, if one favors creatures, it's basically a reanimated deck with a side of Orc Army. While that's fantastic in its own right, it's not really what I wanted, because I've got enough reanimated decks already. Instead, I wanted to make Big Orc, go Unga Bunga, and if all else failed, load my Orc Army into my trusty trebuchet and yeet them at my opponents. Given most games end with my Orc Army having a power and toughness of 50-50, I consider this attempt at making Big Orc a success. Another success would be you engaging with this video. We just hit 100 subs, so if you're enjoying this, you should like, subscribe, and comment telling me your thoughts on this build. So, how do we go from 0 to Unga Bunga? Well, Sauron will generally get us anywhere from 6 to 8 orcs per turn, purely by existing. Very occasionally, it can be less, but equally, it can be much more. Then, he turns our orc army that draws blood into Bilbo from that scene in Rivendell. On top of that, every time the ring tempts us, we get to discard our hand and draw 4 cards. This allows us to dig for our win conditions and fuels all kinds of value goodness. Generally, our deck is trying to play Sauron as early as possible, so that we can get our orc production facility online. Once that's done, we want to hide behind a big scary orc for as long as we can, whilst we find our win conditions, which, more often than not, will be loading our orc army into one of our trusty trebuchets. In terms of what's actually in the deck, here's a quick look at the mana base, the ramp in the deck, our removal, counter spells, our amass engines, card draw, our recursion and value, and of course, our win conditions. There are two major things to note in the deck. The first is that cards with Flashback, Jumpstart, and Madness are woven throughout the deck. Second is that that's equally true for cards that cause the ring to tempt us. Together with Sauron, this creates a value engine where ideally we're pitching our hand and drawing a new one almost every turn. My primary build for this deck is a budget-oriented one for $100. If, however, you want to spend more money on this build or make the deck more powerful, here are a few options to look at. The biggest threat to your game plan are people countering, killing Sauron, or killing our Orc army. Fortunately, Sauron's ward makes him particularly painful to remove, to the point that your opponents almost never will. Be sure to play around your opponents killing your Orc army as you're about to load it into your trebuchet. But again, that's what your counterspells are for. As always, if you have thoughts on this deck, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And I hope you enjoy this base take on Sauron the Dark Lord.